Bonjour à tous et merci d'être avec nous ce matin. I'm really pleased to have Prince Max von Liechtenstein with us today. He is a figure in the world of finance and investing. He currently serves as the CEO of LGT Group. For those of you who don't know, LGT Group is one of the largest wealth management and asset managers globally. He's also extremely committed to one of the topics mentioned earlier, which is sustainable investing. And he has a strong belief that business can contribute positively to society and the environment. Ultimately, this leadership reflects perfectly the Princey family's long-standing tradition of both entrepreneurship and commitment to social responsibility. So welcome, Prince Max, and honored to be here with you this morning. Maybe we'll start with, coming from a business family ourselves, the intersection of values, family and business is actually an interesting topic. And I've heard you speak at the 25th anniversary of LGT Capital, and you spoke a lot about the values. And so would love for you to share how those values are important to you and for LGT.
Sure. And I would also like to start with quelques mots de français.
And I'd like to start with a few words in French, just to say how happy I am to be here today. Many thanks to the organizers for having me here today. I will now switch back to English, since, as you can hear, I am more comfortable speaking English than French.
You pointed out the importance of values to LGT, and you asked a little bit where they're coming from. The family has been around for quite a long time, has a almost 900-year history. And over time, lessons were learned and convictions built up. And it was quite early, sort of a couple of 100 years back, that the family became more organized in their ambition. And they decided that they want to be relevant and they want to be a good force in society by engaging in both business and politics. And then over time, what we have learned is to remain relevant and to be successful at that. It is really quite helpful to pursue things with a long-term and holistic perspective. We have found that to be a real success factor. Another one that we have found to be very important as a key element of our values is that commitment to entrepreneurship, to not just delegating, but really engaging directly, taking some risks, be forward-looking, and get your hands dirty sometimes. And third, the family has also learned that the good old values, doing things the right way, has worked out really well. Good manners, good ethics, a decent sense of humor, a sensible way of communicating in a straight and honest way. These type of old values have we hold them up, and I think it has served us well. And so those we also try to integrate into our family businesses, into LGT. And frankly, I think it has been a key success factor for us.
It's amazing because if you think in today's world, your first value of thinking long term, it's increasingly challenging, right? Governments run in 4-year cycles, public companies quarterly cycles, and interestingly enough, like families and entrepreneurs can take that longer viewpoint, and one of the areas where that's, I think, most important is in things like the climate transition, where a lot of the stats, the fact that we're probably going to miss the 2050 objectives, a lot of people are like, wow, 2050 is, so far, but in terms of climate infrastructure, that's around the corner. How do you think about that value, and is it that value that really solidified your commitment to sustainability and climate?
It's an element of it. Clearly, one of the key challenges of climate change is that from year to year, it's only changing that slowly. And frankly, if you engage in the fight against climate change, it's not very visible. The rewards aren't that fast and that clear. So a lot of the areas that change slowly require long-term thinking, and frankly, long-term thinking doesn't seem to be one of our big human strengths. But how did I get engaged in climate change? I have always been a passionate skier. I was skiing in the Liechtenstein ski team. And frankly, an area where you saw climate change first, and where it first started to bother me, is sort of on the glaciers. We would go up and ski on the glaciers back 30, 40 years ago. Some of these glaciers, frankly, don't even exist anymore. That's where I've seen it first. That's where it bothered me first, and that's where I've also seen that this is a trend that is powerful, and it will only accelerate if you start to understand the physics a bit.
It's funny because I'm a big fisherman, and the rivers keep on getting warmer, which is not good for the fishing. And so that's actually what, it's funny your skiing example, because that's what got me motivated to get involved in climate change as well. It's just feeling the water get warmer and warmer year after year. Managing the wealth for, many of the wealthiest people in the world requires navigating an unknown environment. For many years, the world felt pretty boring. And now it seems that geopolitics is back. How are you dealing with that? And how do you advise your clients in this, increasing world of geopolitical complexity?
It hasn't been that boring for a while, I would say. Coming from a family that has a long tradition of engaging in politics, I have kept telling our folks at LGT and to share that also with our clients that we need to again become more political. We need to care more about politics. I found that a very large number of people who carry a lot of responsibilities really don't understand politics that well, and what they're best at is complaining about politics, which won't help making them any better. I do think that studying politics, engaging in politics, is something which is very, very important, and the challenges that we will face on the political side over the next 20 years, I think we probably all agree, are going to be much, much tougher than what we have seen over the last 30 years.
Going to this, dual hats of entrepreneurship, which you wear, and politics, which your family wears, how do you manage the tension? Because when I first started my business, people in our family group were like, "Whoa, Paul, I'm not sure being an entrepreneur is a good idea. If you fail, it'll hurt the family's reputation." And, there's a lot of risk in terms of, running a business on top of running a country. How do you balance that risk and that potential interdependency? And how do you teach the next generation to not be afraid to go out and take entrepreneurial risks?
If you want to be relevant, you need to take risks. And of course, you will try to take these risks in a responsible and thoughtful and considerate manner. What we have done on the political side is that if you look at the Liechtenstein constitution, the political responsibility that the family holds is sort of more comparable to the one of a chairman of a business, is more sort of the presidential sort of responsibility, where you're not taking as much execution risk, where you are more sort of a person that cares around the long term, oversees things, but sort of the more political risks that need to be taken as well, those are not taken by the head of the family, and so the risk taking is probably a little bit more pronounced on the business side, because of course we all know that in business we all have to take sometimes risks that keep us a little bit awake at night, right?
That's amazing, because I mean there are so many examples of royal families that have that same chairman function, but have not been able to transition in that business world and be relevant to the level that your family has. So congratulations with that. In terms of, we spoke a little bit about sustainability and impact investing. You were big stewards of capital. And so how are you advising the families you advised in terms of their allocations to climate transition? How is that shaping the way you build the LGT?
The first step that I think is very critical and that I try to get across is that you need to care about the footprint of the business that you're managing. Every person, and of course even more so, every business creates impact, leaves a footprint in many, many different dimensions. And certainly we at LGT care very much about the footprint that we create. And one of the most significant ways how we can drive our footprint is by influencing our clients when it comes to the capital allocation process, sometimes in an advisory capacity, but then also roughly a third of the capital that we manage on a discretionary basis. And there, of course, we integrate that impact dimension in a very systemic way in the way we take decisions and how we allocate capital. But telling people that not just risk and return are important dimensions, but that impact is also a dimension that needs to be optimized around. That they haven't learned at business schools yet, and so it takes some time to spread that message.
And more in business, I think what people are realizing is that there are win-win-wins. We're actually, transitioning the business plan to be more sustainable, more impactful, actually leads to bigger multiples and better valuations, because it's, has a longer sustainability. One of the things you've done is, LGT Venture Philanthropy and Light Rock. What is that?
Well, you mentioned two organizations. They actually were at some point one, which was called LGT Venture Philanthropy, which was a division within LGT that I formed shortly after having taken over the CEO responsibility, because I felt that it is critical that wealthy people, and a third of our capital comes from private clients, also invest philanthropically in a wise way. I do generally think that all the ones who are fortunate enough to have accumulated so much wealth, have a responsibility to carry that wealth in a responsible way, and an adequate philanthropic engagement can really create a lot of positive impact. And so we have set up this organization, and initially we were indifferent with regards to the type of organizations that we were backing. Some of them were classically non-for-profit philanthropic organizations, but others were for-profit organizations that also generated very good outcomes. And some of those for-profit organizations then developed quite nicely also from a financial perspective. And at some point somebody came and said, "Aren't you an impact investor?" And then we said, "Well, partly." And so we decided to actually sort of divide that organization and give the investing in impactful sort of for-profit businesses own brand name and legal entity. That's the one that is called Liechtenstein. That has now around 4.5 billion in assets under management. That's mainly investing in private equity, growth capital. We have raised what I think is probably the largest sort of private equity climate fund in Europe, with again a good mix of institutional investors and private clients. So we're having some fun there.
It's interesting because going back to some of the geopolitical topics that tie into the climate transition as well, two of the geographies I've seen your group spend a lot of time in is the Middle East and China. And what's interesting is those are not necessarily regions that we think first and foremost, climate visionaries. But in reality, they both are, with I think China installing more renewable capacity, I think annually, than we have power generation capacity in Europe. And I think the Middle East looking to be, I think, carbon neutral in the next kind of 10 or 20 years. And so visionary places, how are you thinking about building your business in those regions?
Yeah, I think these regions, and it's tough to sort of generalize them because, of course, in the Middle East, things are still very different from China. But, the governance models of these countries has very different types of strengths and weaknesses than what we are used to. One advantage that they have is they actually sort of as the governance and the power is more sort of is less
central. It's more centralized.
More central, doesn't tend to change as often, right? So they can actually afford to take a longer term perspective, which they do. And they have done that quite successfully to progress a number of areas where you need to take a long-term perspective to progress. As Europe has just, again, sort of painfully experienced, you don't learn how to build good batteries within just 2 or 3 years. The Chinese have seen this electrification, the need to decarbonize very strategically early on, and sort of have gone about it in a way that Europe hasn't, right? And so I think we look from our little country, Liechtenstein, naturally sort of always into the other markets and into the rest of the world because our home market is so tiny, and so we try to sort of go after the opportunities where we see them, and Asia has been a hugely successful bet for us. In China, frankly, we have not built up that much of a franchise through LGT, just because the Chinese financial service industry is highly sort of protective, protectionist and nationalistic, and so they don't really let you enter. But we have invested early on quite a bit through private equity, and that has worked out very well.
It's interesting because one of the major kind of macro themes is the fact that private assets are becoming more and more important across the world. I mean, interestingly enough, people have done really well in private equity in China, but the public markets have been much more challenging, and that's been the case throughout a lot of emerging markets. How have you thought about the rise in private assets, the rise of private asset classes, and a theme that we're seeing a lot of, which is the democratization of private assets?
Yeah, look, I started my career in actually private equity in New York in '93. So the family has a long history of engaging in private equity, and we have quite liked it because we felt that the governance of private equity firms tends to be often a bit more long-term oriented and a bit more ambitious. And so we have been early in investing with it, and we have actually, I'm not sure if democratizing is the right word, but we have pioneered evergreen fund that actually is called the Princely Portfolio because it was formed initially just with the capital from the family, and it had a very large allocation to private equity, and we then opened that up to our broader private client base, and that's now a 20 billion sort of portfolio, and has sort of a 35-40% allocation to private markets. As we all know, the challenge with the private markets is the lack of liquidity. So if you wanna sort of provide some liquidity, you need to mix it up with more liquid asset classes, and you need to have some restrictions. And I guess it requires a little bit of experience on how to maneuver these things through the cycles. And we have learned some lessons already in 2008. And I do think that as the industry is now pushing quite hard into that direction, it will be an interesting journey. And it's not entirely trivial. We'll see how well it goes. If I would need to make a forecast, I would also say that we're not going to see sort of private equity returns quite at the same level we have seen historically. So we will see how that's going to play out.
It's interesting because in Canada the theme is just starting, and we actually distribute your product through our network, and it's going well. We'll finish off with a few kind of rapid fire questions. Do you have any mentor that inspires you?
If I sort of reflect on who has inspired me, probably the most, I have to say it was probably my dad, who has been is a pretty unusual character. Has always been quite bold and interesting and unconventional. I think for me it was quite inspiring.
What would be an example of that boldness that really inspired you?
He would always do things that he would run around barefoot. He would have sort of cut off jeans. He would just do things quite differently, a little bit against expectations on many different dimensions. He would sort of do research in physics, but go for alternative physics, trying to understand UFOs and stuff like that. So he was just in many ways a bit of an unconventional sort of mind, and still is who is fun to be with and interesting, and that entrepreneurial strike. Sort of, I think he was a good inspiration for that.
What book have you read recently that's inspired you?
Tying it back a little bit to the good manners and how important they are. A Gentleman in Moscow is, I think, a pretty interesting book that describes sort of a character who, by and large, by those type of traditional good values, excels and manages to get through all kinds of difficulties. And it's well written, and it's a good read for in tough times because it's quite positive and elevating, and it reads nicely.
Love that. And then final question. What gives you hope, especially when it comes to the climate transition?
The technological progress has become so fast, and we're in such a difficult spot right now that you really you need to believe in major innovations who can bail us out a little bit, and how they will play out, we will see. But I think that's what gives me hope.
Well, thank you so much for being us. Thank you for taking the time, and thank you for your comments.
Thank you very much, Paul.